In this video, you'll see all the basics you need to know about asynchronous JavaScript, including callbacks, promises, async await. But to do all of that, we'll need a coding environment. If you already have one opened up, feel free to use that, such as VS Code, Sublime, or whatever you might have. But if you don't already have one, you can go to CodePlay and basically follow along with me. So what we can do is just search for CodePlay and click on that. And to start coding in CodePlay, you don't need to install anything or sign up to anything. We can just click on New Play. Now that we have a place where we can write and execute JavaScript, let's do a couple optimizations so we do a better use of it. So first thing we'll do is to go and change the view to vertical, and then we'll open up the JavaScript console. If you're on a Mac, you can do this with Command Option J, like this. And if you're on a Windows device, you can do this with Control, Shift, and J. But since I'm on a Mac, I did Command Option J. Another way to open up the JavaScript console is to go to View from the menu bar and go to Developer and click on JavaScript console, and it shows Command Option J. For this tutorial, we will only use the JavaScript part so we can minimize the others with CSS and HTML. And now we have all we need right now, and we can close this ad. So we will write all the JavaScript code here, and we will console log some things to here, basically. So at the beginning of the video, we said that we can use callbacks, promises, and async await, and we'll start with callbacks. So one of the first things you should know about callback functions is that you can use callback functions both for synchronous and asynchronous JavaScript code, and let's see actually what they are with an example. So we can write So now that we wrote this code, let's see what's actually happening here line by line. At first, we define a greet function, and that function actually just console logs a hi there. And the second function accepts a function, and that's called a callback function, and calls it inside another function. The major function we run here can also perform other functionality, but the callback part here actually comes from it calling back another function. And the way we use it is, while calling the greet user function, which is this main one here, we will pass it another function called greet here. And once we do that and run it, we can run from the play button like icon here. It will first run hi there. So it accepts the greet function, passes it here and calls it or invokes it, and it keeps performing other function after that. And this is the very first thing we should know about callback functions. And this code actually didn't have any magical part to it since everything was executed line by line. But in the next example, we will see more about callback functions and how we can use them to make them function asynchronously. So to do that, we will go with another example. So I will delete these and write this instead. So in order to have a cleaner working area, we can always go to the console log area and clear the output here. And if we were to run these three lines, we would expect a synchronous behavior in JavaScript and having everything synchronously read and executed line by line. But now we will change the second line here so that it will be executed after all the other functions. And we will do that with a setTimeout function. Inside the setTimeout function, we will pass two arguments. First one is the function we want to run, and the second one is how many seconds or milliseconds we want to delay it with. So in this line, what we do is to pass it an arrow function, and inside the arrow function, we are just console logging async second line. And we are delaying this by 2000 milliseconds. And let's clear the console and run this code. And as you have seen, what happened is that we first got the first line, then we got the third line printed, and after a couple seconds later, which is actually 2 seconds, we got async second line printed here. And with that, we just achieved asynchronous functionality in JavaScript using callback functions. What happens behind the scenes is that JavaScript reads them line by line as usual, but once it gets to this side, it starts a timer and basically puts it aside. And when that timer is done, it comes back to the picture again and it gets executed. But in the meanwhile, rather than blocking the operation and holding the third line from printed, it actually lets everything not freeze and essentially continue performing while it is doing something else in the background. There are also other callback functions like setTimeout function that allows you to run a certain piece of code when a specific event event happens. For example, in web development, other than set timeout, there's set interval which will run your code whenever a certain millisecond or second elapses. And there are also similar functionalities such as onClick or other event listeners that will act based on events and not on just pure line-by-line code execution. And this is what makes asynchronous JavaScript powerful. And this is essentially one of the 3 ways to achieve that. If you're not familiar with the syntax here, especially with the arrow function, arrow functions were introduced with ES6 or ES 2015, and they're quite common in JavaScript. What we're doing essentially is that we are giving no inputs and we just have a function body here, and that function body only has a console log statement here. With that said, let's see the second kind, which uses promises to achieve the same functionality. Promises in JavaScript are just like promises in real life, and intend for promises to be fulfilled at the end of it, but there are times it may fail or get delayed. So all the promises in JavaScript start with something called a pending state, and if a promise gets fulfilled, it has a fulfilled state, and if it fails, for example, if the user's connection went down, it will have the rejected state. So first things first, let's see everything with a code example, and let's start by creating a promise. Okay, so this may look like a lot of code at first, but let's break it down line by line. One of the first things you should know about promises is that we can do 2 things with them. We can create a promise or consume a promise. And at the first step, we instantiate a promise object here by saying new promise, and we pass an arrow function here. And what we pass to that arrow function is a resolve and a reject. So if what we are trying to achieve here with this promise holds to be successful, for example, if we're making a request to either a user or a web server and it happens to be successfully fulfilled, then we will resolve the promise. If not, if the user changes their mind and decides to not upload a picture, we will reject and we will handle that accordingly while keeping all the app running. And what we are doing actually here is that if we can successfully resolve that promise, we will also pass these values to the consumer. So this expected value, we'll actually pass it here. So let's see that in action by clicking on run. And we can see that we returned results successfully with expected value. And we also see something called end of promise. So let's take a closer look at that and see what's actually happening inside the consuming part of our promise. So first we get some promise, and what we do is to chain multiple commands to it with this .then syntax. So first thing is that we get the some promise, we say .then, and we pass an arrow function here, and we handle the successful part inside the .then method. And we are getting this value, and we are console logging returned result successfully with the value here. And we get the expected value printed here. Normally, if you're making a fetch request to a server, you would get the result and convert to the format where it can be displayed to the user. And if something went wrong here, which is also possible, you can cache that error with .catch method and, for example, console log that error here. And we will also see that in a second. Here we also have something called .finally, and this .finally is optional, and it actually allows you to run this finally part no matter if the request is successful or it fails. So in order to see the other scenario, let's change this from true to false. And now we would be simulating the scenario where our request fails, maybe due to an internet connection or something else. So let's run that. Let's actually clear it. And what we get is something went wrong, which is the message we pass with the reject method, and we directly console log that error message here. And at the end, we also say end of promise, and this can be the cleanup or whatever we want to do at the end of that. So whenever we are working with things that can take a long time or may even fail, we don't want to freeze the user interface with synchronous JavaScript, so we can use promises to handle asynchronous functionality. So whenever we are working with asynchronous things in nature, promises is definitely one way to do that. And if we want to do multiple processes, such as cleaning up the data, filtering it, and doing some things to it, we can do it with attaching multiple .thens to the same promise. For example, we can add more .thens here and do some functionality here, then add another .then, and we can essentially chain multiple of them to each other. And promises introduced to the JavaScript with ES6 or ES2015. But within only 2 years, another way of handling asynchronous JavaScript has been introduced, and that actually comes with ES2017, and it is called async await. To see async await in action, you can clear up everything here or just open another code play in a separate window to compare. But for now, I will just clear up this window along with this one. And we can now see async await in action. Currently, async await provides the most clear and concise way of handling asynchronous functionality in JavaScript. Learning about other types can be really helpful, as it will make you a better developer who understands the different tools within the language. And sometimes you may need to use them because maybe other people in your team are using them, or for some reason you may not have access to ES2017 within your JavaScript running environment, or knowing them actually may allow you to convert legacy code bases to more modern ones that use async await. And with that said, let's see how to use async await. So to better see the power of async await, we defined multiple tasks to be completed. And what's different here than just writing sequential JavaScript is that there's a major function here that we are performing other asynchronous tasks. And to do that, we just write the keyword async here just before the function definition. And for each of the tasks that may take an unknown amount of time, we write the keyword await. And in here, we wrote await before the first task as well as before the second tasks. And even though we do not know how long they will take, we can perform them asynchronously in the background without freezing the user interface or freezing other functionalities. We can perform other functionality here, such as console logging some statements or performing other functions here. So let's run this code and see it in action. You have to fix that. That's a request. And let's see that in action. And we get the first task complete, second task complete successfully, and we got all tasks completed. So everything here is executed in the order we expected them, and all of them are running asynchronously. And this would be the same case if some of them was taking 5 seconds, some of them were taking 2 seconds, as the await keyword would await for them to complete and return the result. And with async await, you can do everything you can do with promises, but in a shorter fashion. And this is also why async await is the way to go for main developers when working with asynchronous functionality in JavaScript. With that said, I hope you got some value out of this video, and I will see you in the next one.